Hello everybody, welcome to the afternoon session here at the lovely Leeds Art Gallery. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague to introduce this afternoon's speakers. We've got 3 speakers, we've got a small break, and then we're followed by the final speakers of the day. So if I can welcome Dr. Kif Bamford, who's a reader in the School of Art, Architecture and Design, and he will be chairing our first panel this afternoon. Thank you, Kif.
Thank you. Double introductions. So, like this morning, we've got 3 speakers doing 15 minutes, followed by 5 minutes questions, and then a short break. The 3 sessions look like they're going to be really interesting, dealing with student exhibitions and one looking at the publicity for degree shows. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Andy Brodie from UCLan, University of Central Lancashire. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Andy Brodie. I'm a member of the collective Attack. Richard Hudson Miles is also with us today, is also a member of Attack. I'm going to talk about a project that we did at University of Central Lancashire where I worked last year. And some of you who were at last year's conference might have seen us sort of building up to doing that. We talked about it then. So we're going to reflect on what happened in the project, and in some ways what happened in the project was a bit of a kind of microcosm of the kind of current political crisis in the United Kingdom. What I'm going to talk through is a kind of condensation of an article we've got coming out next week in a journal called Research and Education. So look out for that if you want some more information on it. But I'm just going to talk through the project and some of the kind of theoretical reflections that we had coming out of the project. University galleries are contested spaces. Aspirations to deliver ambitious exhibition programmes usually have to be tempered with budgetary constraints and demands of university marketing departments. The latter frequently relegate university galleries into flexible event spaces that couple with dubious models of student participation in the annual spectacle of final year degree shows. Yet expansions in art research and alternate pedagogic models, Andrew Hunt has recently claimed, can free university galleries from these constraints, allowing them, he says, to act as models for intelligent and provocative research in a non-hierarchical framework. Established in 2012, Hanover Project, within the University of Central Lancashire, seeks to fulfil this model. The space is run by a steering committee of fine arts staff within the university, and in addition to its exhibition programme, offers students live work experience and an opportunity to collaborate with professional artists. We get them to do their own shows within the gallery. This paper reflects on one such opportunity, a 3-month exhibition project titled Messy Democracy, co-authored between the artist collective Attack and BA and MA students at UCLan. Attack envisaged the project as a pedagogic demonstration of the difference between democracy and consensus, in order to reframe notions of inclusion and participation within the neoliberal university. The model we looked to was the art school occupations at Hornsey, Brighton, Guildford, Croydon and Leeds, as well as other places, in the year 1968, which we consider to be democratically productive forms of practice. Envisaging our residency 50 years later, we identified a similar intent in Stefano Hani and Fred Moten's notion of the undercommons, a mechanism they view as generative of a beyond of teaching, capable of making the systematic interpolation of democracy and/or politics by the university visible. The undercommons necessitates scandalous actions on the parts of educators to challenge the university's recuperative maintenance of the prevailing order and insurgent deformations of financialisation and commodification. Within this epistemic police order, Roncière contends that scandal can only be acknowledged when staged as visibly and dramatically as possible. Within his system, the spectacularization of dissensus, or the egalitarian claim of the part that has no part, constitutes politics, a form of ideological and democratic struggle so dependent on dramatization that Hallward has characterized this as theatocracy. And that's a very, very important model that we explored through the project. This is due to the staging of dissensual voices otherwise ignored by the miscount or illusory harmony of consensus at the heart of commonplace notions of community and democracy. Messy Democracy, our exhibition, tested the capacity of theatocracy to initiate scandalous action and dramatise an undercommons by staging the total removal of knowledge labour from the teaching scene. Our anticipation was that this spectacle of non-teaching would highlight the paradox that everybody has the capacity to learn without, Roncière says, a master explicator, yet no one wants to cope with the intellectual revolution this signifies. And he talks about this in his book, The Ignorant Schoolmaster. Art education is a particularly suitable context for such an experiment because it combines the contested scenes of pedagogy with equivalent challenges around social engagement in the visual arts, represented by circumspect attitudes to the buzzword participation within our practice. We argue this vexed relationship between participation and agency is in fact a consequence of democracy and can only attempt to stage this as a disagreement to allow irreducibly dissensual elements to become visible in their maddening political heterogeneity. Roncière argues the theatocratic model manifests the discontinuity between democracy as a form of, between democracy as a form of government and democracy as a form of social and political life. As democratic paradox, so the former must repress the latter. As a result, governmental action, including the suppression of democratic impulses of the demos, can be exempted in the name of democracy. This is kind of the irony within democracy's consensus. And Derrida has referred to this implosive quality as democracy's auto-immunity. In theatocracy, these dynamics are negotiated by a plurality of voices in dissensus. Davies has identified three distinct phases in theatocracy: an argumentative demonstration, a theatrical dramatization, and processes of heterologic disidentification. By opening discontinuity between governance and the actions of people, theatocracy's phases dramatize democratic paradox. The exhibition, Messy Democracy, demonstrates how these parameters fragment and intersect in a complex dynamic. The argumentative demonstration consisted of a declaration issued by attack via the university's internal channels and of the transformation of the gallery space into a semi-autonomous site of student-led making and learning. This gesture was coupled with the cladding of the white cube space in chipboard, and this dramatised the opening of an alternate structure of action within the university. You can see the cladding on the wall to your left there. The withdrawal of academic workers from this space also mobilised the gallery as a scandalous undercommons, generating forms of dissensus set apart from everyday educational practice, proliferating disidentification. These gestures represent the production of an interstitial distance within the university. Mahoney claims, who writes on interstitial distance, Mahoney claims that recent student protests and occupations in Central St Martin's and NCAD in Dublin, for example, have opened interstitial distances within these institutions, whilst operating at a critical distance from them. Simon Critchley claims actions of this kind operate, he says, within the state against the state, in a political articulation that attempts to open a space of opposition. As interstitial resistance, messy democracy served as a multi-agental, live theocratic test of how democratic paradox mediates the ignorant one's lesson. The exhibition's development began on the 12th of February last year through a meeting with 18 students from BA Fine Art, MA Fine Art and MA Photography, during which participants formed a steering committee. We expected dissensus and political argumentation, but immediately learnt establishing a Roncierian pedagogy was difficult. We could not even start without recourse to pedagogico-managerial briefings. In contrast, attempts to facilitate inclusion generated heterology and argumentation, but also debilitating stasis. An example was an activity involving participants discussing their perceptions of problems within higher education. Complaints about gender inequality by some students were attacked by others as an attempt to hijack the space in the name of feminism and identity politics. Similarly, when one student disclosed her autism to the group, she felt others framed it incorrectly as a disability. As the process atrophied, participants increasingly viewed working together to be more viable outside the theocratic model and prioritised agreement mediated by the steering committee. And this is a kind of interesting set of contradictions that started to emerge within the project. In a subsequent session, the question of how to accommodate themes of gender, class and student fees within an exhibition exacerbated antagonisms. Nonetheless, these debates also generated organised student dissensus, such as a group action entitled Cunt House, a reference to Judy Chicago and Miriam Shapiro's 1972 exhibition Woman House. To reconcile disagreements, students compromised on an open call mediated by the Standing Steering Committee, a rolling programme of actions within the gallery to which each participant contributed in ways that might conceivably lead them to rearrange existing installations. One thing's worth noting with the open calls, we sort of set out with that with the intention of accepting everyone's proposal. It was just a kind of way of proposing processes for the exhibition. Anyway, this participatory structure allowed practices to commingle, and after initially consenting to work separately, participants often arrived at informal co-working arrangements. For example, the gallery became an informal creche, seemingly without prior planning. Each of these aspects enabled participants to disrupt the consensus model from which they started. The Hanover Project Residency tested a Roncierian model of politics in a chaotic and intermittent manner. Nonetheless, we can identify different moments in the project with different components of the theocratic event. Argumentative demonstrations were dramatised in the organised sessions, and the exhibition staged reciprocal tensions between emergent consensus structures and dissensual provocations. In this process, identities were subjected to heterologic disidentifications through the friction between the student as consumer and producer and the gambit of the independent learner and the absent teacher. To learn democratically appears to mean sustaining the stage capable of spectacularising dissensus and permitting those actions to collapse the stage that is their support. Within this process, we also identified an auto-immunitary tipping point, whereby moments of democratic dissensus ossify into forms of anti-democratic consensus management. Access to the spectacle of visibility thus appears to be synonymous with the social articulation of each participant's interests, manifest as a dissonant rhythm of inclusion and exclusion. By transgressing modes of governance, the demos achieves a capacity to learn. Staging democracy through participation and co-authorship produced numerous mobile archipolitics, each vying for overall control and authorship of the exhibition. The purpose of theatocracy is to stage this dissensual and anarchic rhythm in perpetuity. As clarification of the promise Hunt identifies with university gallery spaces, we foreground the issue of interstitial distance, and the necessity of the undercommons. Through our residency at UCLan, we found that it is possible to think of dissensus as learning, as democracy. If it is possible to do this, it is through the optics of otherness opened through the collapsed stage of theatocracy. For spaces such as Hanover Project, we propose this might extend to a general curatorial approach. In this mode, the gallery, as theatocratic scene and scandalous gesture, would enact the ignorant one's lesson as the process of learning as democracy, the equal inclusion of the demand of the part who has no part through the task of translation. In its current usage, inclusion is the reified mantra of self-deluded officials and educators who think they can act in the interest of debt-ridden students calibrated according to performance indicators. In contrast, theatocracy radicalizes inclusion as an intention grounded in disagreement, indicating the form learning and art might take as practices of a democracy to come. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Excellent timekeeping, despite the revolutionary aspect of your paper. So we have time for questions and responses.
Your rhetorical statement about inclusion at the end was one that essentially, as somebody who's no longer part of the university system, I would take from outside, I would agree with. But it seems to me that, like lots of projects that in various ways mirror yours over an extensive period of time, there's a dependence upon the institution's inclusion of you to be able to make the work. You know, this was a residency in the university that you were presumably invited or commissioned to undertake or had applied for or whatever. So there seems to me to be some kind of tension, at least, between the rhetorical positioning and the dependence upon the institutions to do what they do.
I think in some ways the kind of shadow of institutional critique is kind of there within our project, and that issue of wanting to be part of the situation where decisions are being made is kind of important to the politics of what we're doing. I think the kind of where that point might lead you is to the kind of the invention of pure outside, and I don't think those places exist.
Can I just say as well, it's a dramatisation of that paradox, right? Exactly. So the thing about this project is it's a module where kind of Andy or whatever, me as a visitor, is expected to teach, and what you do is not teach and just leave the students alone for a month, right? So the fact that you are needed as an employee of the institution to give the students a one-month platform to make work, doing whatever they want and designing their own curriculum is an interesting kind of conflictual dynamic there, you know. So the students get to reinvent their own education for a week by you withdrawing your academic labour, which you get paid for non-teaching although you are that the students are dependent on you to make that gesture. It's an interesting paradox, and I think the Roncierian mode of argument is to demonstrate simultaneously those different facets.
It's also potentially exploitative model, as well as
Possibly.
as you describe it.
Possibly.
Go on. Like public school boys recreating the old group.
Any other comments to either add to that or to take it into the direction?
Just as you mentioned Peter Holwood, and you used this term autocracy, which you cited reference to him. Autocracy, could you say a bit more about that?
Theatocracy, so it kind of emerges throughout Roncier's writing as he looks at... It's a paper on Roncier, yeah, absolutely. And Roncier looks back to sort of instances of 19th century theatre, for example, where the audience sort of starts standing up and kind of speaking back to the people on the stage, and he writes on that as a kind of mobilisation of dissent, in a way that kind of he sees as being politically productive, and then the visibility of that dissent becomes a form of social inclusion for that audience.
I just wanted to, ask a question that was asked earlier. I think of Martin New's presentation, which was how aware are the students of what you've just told us?
We spoke about this project last year at last year's conference, and we brought through the students who were participating on the project with us to sort of articulate it. We're also writing...
But presumably students have very different levels as individuals of ability or interest to engage with these issues. I suppose that's something I'm quite interested in as working in an institution where the students have made this happen. And we are trying to listen to it and enjoy it and allow it, but it's kind of come from them. And I'm sort of just slightly, I can imagine really kind of high functioning, high achieving students really rising to this intellectual challenge. I wonder what happens to students who maybe, aren't ready for the shock of that lack of structure.
Yeah, it was the setup of the project was difficult, and people kind of came to it and went away from it, and then other people came along to it as well, and within the process, the group we put together, the House, became very. They sort of started to function as a kind of block. So we learned a lot of things about kind of those kind of dynamics through the kind of realisation of the project. It wasn't perfect by any means.
The other thing as well is, sorry for talking question. The other thing as well is the majority of the faculty didn't bother, didn't care. They didn't want to be included. They're not interested. And the factor of democracy, which is unlike a module where you're forced to teach someone, non-compliance or non-participation or non-response is an irreducible condition of democracy, right? You can't manage someone into a democratic right to express themselves, which you try and do as part of an arts curricula, don't you? You force an output out of people.
But I think, and this comes back to kind of the public school boys comments, I think facilitation within these processes is very difficult, and power dynamics, rhythm of power dynamics, but I don't think that means you should stop facilitating.
And I'm not indicating that. It's not veiled criticism, it's actually something very similar is happening from a different perspective. And I am noticing that there are people who are not part of that conversation, and that comes down to sometimes demographic, to do with racial differences, cultural differences. And I'm noticing how exclusive, and in our case it's student led, how exclusive it can be. And
and that's part of how you set it up, and that's part of the thinking we're now doing. It's a very important question.
We'll take one last point.
I think I'm following on slightly more interested in, if you like, how this, if you like, fits into another kind of momentum, or where it goes, or where it connects. I mean, we've had some experiences in my university where you could say that certain almost agitprop exhibitions have occurred, not by fine art students, but actually by other students who have got together because they for various, for a whole set of reasons, they didn't want a particular invited speaker to attend an event, and then they decided to have an exhibition, giving the reasons why they didn't want this person to attend the event. And these things were happening outside of this context. So how do we make the kind of connections? Because, it seemed to me to be an important event that had come from somewhere completely elsewhere. And yet it seems significant that we ought to be trying to make some connection between these different happenings of importance that are not always located in the way that yours was.
So that is a comment, but I'm happy for that to be a comment.
Yeah. Should we hear that as a comment? I think there are lots of discussions to be had about this, but I am aware of the democratic situation, and Richard has only voices all the time. So this is Richard Hudson-Miles, who's going to present next. We also like to say thank you to all.
Okay, as this is loading up, I have an apology. My abstract got cut in half, and the bit that remained is the bit that I've dumped, so we're not going to get to Roncier today. If anyone's come expecting that. We're not going to get to it. There we go. Okay. I've got a lot, so I'm going to try and work quickly, so I'm just going to jump straight in. I'm a recovering Althuserian, I say at the start here, right? And what my sort of trendy mission today is to revive the Althuserian symptomatic reading. For those unfamiliar, it's like a kind of a psychoanalytic, quasi-psychoanalytic double reading, where you read the kind of surface layer of a text, expose its contradictions, and then unpick its underlying, energizing kind of problematic. And that way you can kind of read a text in the way that it answers questions that it doesn't seem to have posed. So it's like being on the psychoanalyst's couch. So we're going to try and access the unconscious of these texts in the way that Marx did in Adam Smith, when he spotted that Adam Smith recognized the contradictions of capital but couldn't explain them. Or Althusser and his group in the Reading Capital seminars. Roncier famously split with them. Did with Marx, where he discovered that the problematic underlying early Marx was all kind of a bourgeois humanist problematic. The latter was a replicable in capital. This is theory of kind of value, the commodity form, a science, right? Anyway. There's all sorts of reasons, right, why you wouldn't want to revive Althusserianism. I'm not going to go into them there, but obviously people who know Althusser's history will know some of those. For Roncier particularly, Jacques Roncier, his former student, and like I say, we're not going to get to Roncier particularly, but for Roncier, Althusserian theoreticism, which is what it became known as, which is the theory of theoretical practice, it died on the barricades of 1968, which we've just been talking about, in the face of the student uprisings, against which Althusserianism started to look like dry, elitist, academic, authoritarian, and the worst of all, counter-revolutionary, to phrase it slightly differently. The class struggle in theory, which is what Althusser talked about his project as, takes you too far away from the class struggle in the street. So, whilst people want to leave Althusserianism on the corpse of 1968, and by the way, I am taking liberties with the Althusserian symptomatic reading here. It's much more of a kind of I don't know. I'm probably doing a lot of violence to the Althusserian methodology. But what I want to do is basically look at the slippages. There's a pun intended there by the Kingston School of Art show, right? And this looks a bit like a Rorschach test anyway. I want to look at the slippages of the surface level discourses of these texts, these publicity images, against their underlying problematic, and hopefully we can get to the politics in the street, as it were, right at the end. But before then, I think Althusser was the theorist concrete analysis of concrete situations. Again, I don't have time in 15 minutes to do that. I wish I could develop this, but obviously we know the current conjuncture. Possibly another reason for reviving Althazar within the current conjuncture is it would be very easy to claim a role for the university or the art school as an ideological state apparatus shackling students to neoliberalism through this kind of pedagogy of debt that's entrenched within its curriculum. This is, I don't know if anyone knows, this is the University of Leeds Fine Art Degree Show from 2013. This is the collective value to the university of the graduating cohort of fine art students. So they're questioning the value of their education. I guess it's a sort of Hans Hacker-esque piece of institutional critique as a degree show there, right? And this is from a self-styled, I think. Anyone who knows the University School of Art is sort of a Marxist school. Post-Marxist school, less my old original art school, which we saw today, weirdly, but anyway. Some are less committed, more kind of generalised, and a little bit, I think, more uncertain and fragile when you start to scratch the surface of these. You made it. Obviously, it's celebratory, but it's also like a sigh of relief. God, you made it. God, you've escaped a terrible fate. You made it despite everything. Others take flight, which, again, is a metaphor of new beginnings and rebirth. But it's also a phrase which describes escape, escaping incarceration. It also describes fleeing the scene of a crime, even, So the other glaring reason for these repeated sort of contradictory characteristics in these images are inescapably, right? These are revenue-raising images for a business, which trades off the kind of dreams, I suppose, of its young students. And at the same time, they're institutional lies, right? They're self-mythologizations. The lies like a patient tells themselves to reassure themselves that they're not really sick. These contradictions are rooted in what Althazar would call the problematic, this deep problematic of the art school, which we mentioned art and language earlier. Right from the start, Malcolm Quinn's excellent book on utilitarianism and the birth of the art school. In the Victorian era, right, the art school, as art and language pointed out, is governed by a contradictory problematic. On the one hand, of romantic possessive individualism, which it gets from a European tradition of Western philosophy. And on the other hand, a British kind of tradition of utilitarianism, which emphasizes like a kind of a need. The art school should supply something. Or individualism versus instrumentalism, you might say. It's a clash in the psyche of the art school, which you still feel played out today. So in the Victorian art schools, this wasn't so much of a problem. They were very clearly quite dismal places for reproducing the workforce for industrial capitalism. But subsequently, the sort of humanist, romantic ideology has disguised this. This kind of disconnect is the reason why employability and such other metrics kind of jar with the kind of art school's kind of ego ideal. Very quickly, like I said, I don't have time to develop this within 15 minutes, but the current conjuncture of neoliberalism, this is an amazing book on how neoliberalism kind of perverts everything by Wendy Brown. It's really worth reading. Anyway, as Brown argues, one of the effects of neoliberalism is it economizes everything, including culture, to the extent that we approach everything in life, even including art or art education, in terms of a financial kind of transaction rather than some kind of qualitative human kind of endeavor. In terms of education now, it's presented not as an individual good, is it, but it's a human capital investment in oneself. We judge the quality of that investment through financial data, performance management metrics internally to the university, like the TEF-REF, KEF, consumer satisfaction surveys like the NSS. And I don't have time to do this, but this is Exchequer data. I mentioned this before at a previous NAFI conference, right? The investment as a human capital investment for art students is an absolutely atrocious one. You're projected to lose money over a lifetime, right? Not gain money. Importantly, lose money for the country as well, not gain money, which will raise questions about whether art students should be allowed to access higher education at all. Anyway, That's the conjuncture, right, with financialised art education, to the point where it seems like a bad investment for the country and the individual. So despite this, we've got to advertise art education to a new generation. This is Batley School of Art, kind of local to here. I like their approach to fight that dismal economic reality. They take a refreshingly kind of straightforward approach, right? Their fine art degree show has just been called Create for the last couple of decades, right? So, I mean, aside from the obvious kind of joke that that's not very creative, right? I think there's something funny about calling your show Create, Create, Create. All of this sort of repetitive nature of this. Create, 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 create in 2007. It sort of starts to look like anxious, like desperate, like maybe like the superego of the university. Like maybe it's chastising its own students and staff like an authoritarian headmaster, right? Create, create, create. On the other hand, thinking about this kind of humanist problematic, you know, which exists in tension with utility, this repetition of create, create, create. It sort of sounds like a cry for help, like we're wanting some sort of essential force or capacity of the human to drag the neoliberal art school out of its kind of capitulation to the economic. In his book, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Sigmund Freud formulates the idea of repetition compulsion, which describes the patient's response to trauma or difficult events by engaging in compulsive repetitive behaviours. It's a form of working through trauma. Remember, repeat, work through. It can take three main forms, according to Freud, all of which you could fairly claim as unconscious explanations for these Batley posters. So first, in dreams, recurring dreams serve the function of repeatedly bringing the patient back to the situation of his accident. Create, create, instead of being stopped from creating. Secondly, repeated behaviours, like this is particularly true in infants, right? Such as the child chucking his toys away, then retrieving them, only to throw them away again. This is a sense of mastering loss, in this case the maternal figure. Thirdly, repetition, sometimes used during therapy to explore your repressed past. You repeat the repression in order to kind of master it. And finally, there's kind of a thing that Freud calls, which I'm not going to get a chance to talk about in much depth, but it's a destiny neuroses. And this comes from a kind of a guilt complex about achieving your goals, self-actualizing, meeting your ambitions. Because of that guilt, the patient finds a way to self-sabotage their own success, believing some higher power or demonic thought force is thwarting them. So, what is the trauma of the art school, if not its neoliberal economization? On top of this kind of duality of its rival discourses of romantic individualism and utility or employability, right? These degree show posters telling us to create, 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 keep creating, master the trauma, keep the malevolent demonic forces that thwart us at bay. There's no hope of ever repaying your student debt or embarking on a successful career that will allow you to be a functioning member of society, but nevertheless create, create, create as a nightmarish Nietzschean eternal return, a life or dream lived over and over again with nothing ever new in it. Importantly for Freud, these repetitive activities appear to contradict the individual's search for pleasure. The pleasure principle, that's us seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, satisfying our psychological and human needs. In fact, for Freud, this repetition is a manifestation of a much more deeper instinctual drive, the death drive, a desire to destroy, to return to a kind of more primitive state. The desired primitive state for the art school is pure ideology, right? Creativity, the most metaphysical of concepts, inseparable from romantic myths of individual genius. So these posters, through them, we can perhaps recognize the death drive of the art school, maybe. The last desperate defense of the art school against its economization. I know I'm picking on Batley a little bit here, but if you do a survey of the publicity images of degree shows, this kind of trope is not peculiar to Batley. So we have that in Scarborough, right? You know, as well. For their degree shows. At good old Leeds Beckett, it's just simply do. It's more pragmatic. Just Just, just do something, do anything, right? Anything at all. Which is, the lecturer's kind of exasperated cry, isn't it, as you drag students through the modules. Despite the horror, the economic horror outside, there's something good inside, or there's something good inside us, despite this kind of dismal fate that we're all being led into, right? Outside, we're shackled to neoliberalism by our student loans, but inside there's something good. This is refreshingly honest appraisal. Just isolates. It's like the degree show of Marx's economic and philosophical manuscripts, right? So it's like man alienated from his species being all estranged labour. And sometimes they're kind of, this is a good example of the destiny neurosis. I want to fulfill my dream, but I can't. I want to, but I'm being prevented for all sorts of reasons. Another trauma, just skipping through them, is this kind of separation anxiety. This is obviously a reference to Mary Kelly, isn't it? But I think it's particularly apt. It tells us an answer to a question that's not posed, right? In that Althusserian phrase. It's irresistible for me anyway to link this to the kind of forced infantilization of the student within the neoliberal university, right? Where government are telling us to act as in loco parentis to students, right? Leeds College of Art, this is not the end. This is not the end. Sounds a bit desperate, doesn't it? Like a divorcee unwilling to face the reality of a separation. Also, this is not the end of your trauma. This is not the end of the horror. Anyway, resignation towards an unrepayable debt mountain. A busted flush. This is another the moment where you realise your dreams amount to nothing and you spent 3 years and 50 grand making fantastic but ultimately useless rubbish. But there's a side, and this is where if I'd had more time, and obviously you don't want me to hog the stage, but I would have gone into Rancière and the idea of political subjectification through ideology and discourse, and how that can be resistant. So to draw to this kind of conclusion, which I'll have to develop at another day, there's images like this that kind of embrace this sort of romantic, almost nihilistic kind of two fingers to the world, right? So what of the future? To hell with it. There's something fiercely defiant, right? I know I'm going to get into a load of debt, but I'm happy and I'm going to do it anyway. A kind of a live for the moment attitude, right? So I guess the point I want to conclude with is that this problematic of bourgeois romantic individualism, which emphasizes the free individual, right? And it's everywhere in all the concepts that we use in all of our curriculums. It's that problematic, that ideology that directly inculcates subjectivities that are totally resistant to the disciplinary effects of neoliberal economization. Revolutionary subjectivities, in fact, like in '68, as in kind of now, who currently are beginning to establish their own art schools or their own paths. The philosopher of education, Judith Sweeter at UCL, has recently noted that there's a hair's breadth, right, which separates the ideology of free market neoliberalism and the free individual of a self-organized anarchist society. So these new autonomous art schools, formed or subjectified through the economization of the art school and forged within its romantic ideology, are effectively functioning anarchism. They're conjuring directly the demonic forces thwarting the kind of ambitions of the neoliberal art school and stoking its death drive. The same is true on the barricades of '68, where the students tore up the paving stones to dream of the beach and graffitied "What use is Althusser" all over the walls of the École des Beaux-Arts. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you. We've got time for a couple of questions. One there and one back.
I suspect this is quite a relevant point, but it's addressed to you as what you call a recovering artist. and it occurred to me while you were giving the presentation that, one of the things is that Roger Scruton, the sit-ins and so on, and even the sit-in at LSE, predating that. Then the philosophical and ideological kind of things informing that were not to do with continental philosophy.
No.
And even your possessive individualism, which Paul Wood uses in Studio International, in the politics of art education.
Yeah, it's very much.
Is not a continental concept. It's so. I'm just wondering whether you could kind of reflect on this business about the Rancière Althusser kind of armature, as it were, that you're providing, and how that, as it were, is out of step with what you could say, the Anglo-American kind of analytic sort of scenario, which existed at the time when, in 68, 69, and so on.
Right. Okay, so I'm interested in the Althusser-Rancière dynamic particularly, as in, Althusser, when the students were occupying universities, took what you might call a reactionary or conservative position in that he said, no, you students, you can't kind of dictate the terms of your own education because you don't know what you're on about, basically. You need people like me to guide you. So there's a power dynamic that's part of being a lecturer there. But I don't know, in these occupations are interesting to me, so Rancière's on the other side of that, right? And this is how he develops the ignorant schoolmaster kind of position, really, he wasn't involved in those occupations, but he directly, learns from that moment of 68. In Hornsey in 68, right, you had loads of Marxists. Tariq Ali tried to turn up and kind of start to act as the theorist, and the students kicked him out. So yeah, they're not interested in Marxism, continental philosophy. They're purely interested in becoming a kind of an ideological subjectivity that you associate with being a pure artist, right? It's a total fantasy. But I guess my point is that it's a total illusion. My point is that subjectivity is it can be particularly revolutionary, right? It sort of doesn't need theory. Does that answer the question?
No.
Theoreticism steps all over that subjectivity, right? So if we're talking about art education as emancipation, shouldn't we be trying to let that subjectivity just grow monstrously and see what happens, rather than enclosing it in an institutional theoretical frame? And I'm aware I'm complicit in that as well, right?
I'm going to suggest that one continues at the break, but I did say that Sheila could have a question.
I've got a comment, really. Thank you for entertaining us with that. But as it is the Fine Art Educators Forum today, the Subject Association, I think we need the other backstory. When I looked at is it 2013 to 16 or 17 of Batley, we need to remember that was a department in teacher. That was a department closed down and closing out. So there's no student voice left there in the end. And there is, it was down to one member of staff in the end. So that's another really important story that goes in there that he seemed fitting with when he presented it.
What was that, sorry?
We do need that context. You didn't hear me.
No, I missed what story? But
the process that you showed
Posters from Batley
what led to the end of Batley as an art school.
was as an HE department, the BA, the Fine Art. I
apologise.
That's when marketing take over. That isn't about student voice. I think there should be some caution, and I think we need to recognise that because they were very close colleagues to us here.
Well,
I'm done.
No, that's a really good point. But I mean, also in fairness, I think Richard was saying that that it's the institution that is voicing these crises as much as the student body. So it's not, So I think we want to.
Well, I feel so. There's massive. I can spot the ones that are from the student voice, are from the messy democracy or the, happy community, contributing community. They are contributing in the marketing department. But it did sit badly with me, the continuity of point about badly, because that was colleagues losing their jobs.
And you might have to act as a specificity to
Yeah,
spaces.
absolutely.
if it's a quick one,
Well, it's just a point. I mean, the way you were going through that, it did remind me of the rules analysis of efflux, curatorial statements, where they came up with the notion of international art English. You know, some people don't know it's very amusing because of the way it looks at the particular way that the language and ideology comes through through all these very different supposed statements, but you know, it's always the transformation. It has very particular sorts of ways that it talks about art and art practice as it comes through those gallery statements, and they themselves reveal a great deal about the way that models of art and art practices, which then feed back into art courses and art students' perception of what the game is, as it were.
Thank you. I'm aware of time. I just say thank you to you all for the question. Okay, thanks everybody. We met Katrina this morning, speaking on behalf of her colleague. Now she's going to speak on behalf of herself. So, Katrina, you're the Chelsea. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry about the technological issues. Yes, my name is Katrina Elder. I am a colleague of Martin's. I teach on the BA Fine Art at Chelsea as a theory tutor, but I also run a course called the Graduate Diploma in Fine Art. And I'm also a researcher. And the thing that I've been researching mostly in the last few years is the degree show. And also recently, kind of more generally, about this idea of making public how do we kind of make ourselves connect to the world in a productive and critical way. Oops. I can't use a PC, that's a slight problem, but let's see. So just to start off with, when I started this research, it was very much from a point of being very mindful of the degree show as a very enabling thing in so many ways, so that you see the student kind of trajectory often, it's like phenomenal. From Easter to June to the degree show, there's this enormous development. So my research started from a point of thinking there's something very interesting going on here. I need to look at this more, and it's also, but it's not kind of necessarily clear-cut positive. There's also problems around, what this sort of trajectory. And as I started looking, what I really found was that there is very little. I mean, there isn't really a lot around the degree show. It really is under-theorized. It's under kind of contextualized. There is very little written. There is very little sort of done so far on it. And I think maybe this is changing, and that's sort of some of the talks we've had today. And this idea that this morning there was this mention of the under-reporting, and I think this is definitely an area that has been extremely under-reported. I'm going to do a very, very short detour, first of all. I'm going to talk about a garden feature called the ha-ha, or ha-ha, or aha. Different people say it in a different way. And this is partly also to do with the English context. I mean, this is NAFI is an English organisation. It, of course, has links, but I am not English, and I've always been interested in sort of the difference between my very early formative art education and my subsequent art education in England. And I'm talking very much from a point of Chelsea in particular, but also UAL more broadly, which is the sort of University of the Arts that Chelsea is part of. So let's try and imagine that Chelsea is performing this structure at a degree show time. And this structure is the ha-ha. It's a sort of structural feature designed to give an unbroken vista and yet at the same time stop, for instance, livestock getting anywhere near the grand house. So it's a particular feature of the English garden, and it kind of has a particular link then to Enlightenment. And what was really interesting to me is this idea of the English garden as trying to set up a garden that is what they call gardenesque, meaning it looks more like a garden than a garden would naturally ever do. So it's sort of trying to enhance a sort of natural looking garden, but through incredible intervention. And I think this is an interesting idea in relation to thinking about some of the things that we try and make the exhibition, the student exhibition do. this idea of making something very recognizable as something, but more than itself in some way. What I'm also really aware of, or what I'm beginning to really think, is that perhaps, especially in that top drawing where there's this ditch, I think it's in that area, if we think about this as a metaphor, where we can find all the things that we need to really look at and explore. And in fact, when I use this as a metaphor for thinking about the research I did, and my way into the research and the different areas that I looked at, it was also a sense of this structure being reversed. So if you have a stately home, it's mostly about the view from the institution, from the stately home and out. And I'm interested in perhaps, for the art school, it's the opposite. For the degree show, there is a sort of that creates an unbroken vista into the institution, but it doesn't go the other way. The students cannot see out in the same way, and this unbroken vista is an illusion. It's not real. There is definitely a wall that way as well. So this sets up using this kind of this is how I kind of began in a way, which might seem like a very roundabout way to do some research, but it enabled me to think about some of the questions that I wanted to raise around this problematic area, and in particularly these four questions, or not questions, but sort of areas of exploration. So the first one is really thinking about audience, because the idea of an exhibition, in a way, completely talks about audience. Without an audience, can we even talk about exhibitions? And the second is this thing that has also been talked about today earlier, is the relationship between the student and the academy. This is not always a harmonious relationship. There can be a lot of tension there. And we can also ask, who is the degree show for? Is it for the student? Is it for the academy? Who owns this event? And then, for all of us in this room, I think the third one, the learning, that this is a pedagogic moment. It's something that, it's something that the 3 years builds up to, and it's often, like at Chelsea, it is the main part of your degree that you leave with comes from that moment, comes from the degree show. And then finally, the academy and in society. And I keep talking about the academy. We don't talk about academies in the UK, but I think it's an interesting one in terms of a useful word sometimes, in terms of thinking about this positioning of art schools, which are sometimes like Chelsea are, art and design kind of entity, and in other places it's connected to other sort of subjects and other areas. So it's about thinking about this specific thing to do with fine art, using the word academy to sort of fence that out in some way. And we mentioned just earlier about utilitarianism and Malcolm Quinn's book on that early relationship when the UK art school was first set up by Henry Cole, where there was this very specific and clear idea about this relationship. And this is something we no longer have, and I think it's, we'll end up with thinking about how can we perhaps get back to that. Thinking about the degree show, it's been a little bit like a frame, or if we're going to go the continental route, we could talk about Foucault's idea of the diaspositive, where there is this sort of thing we use to be able to look at other things through or with as a tool. But more useful for me perhaps also was to deploy some sociological framework. And I was heavily influenced here by Morgan Quaintance and an article he wrote on INIVA, International Institute of Visual Arts, around that institution. And I was interested in these ideas of what are the forces at play in terms of trying to address these questions. What are the things that we have to sort of deal with in that way? So coercive isomorphism, I'm still not sure how to say this because no sociologists have told me, but this idea that there are kind of actual and real pressures. That would be, for instance, in the case of Chelsea, it could be UAL, or more broadly, it could be the QAA or governmental directives, real things that we have to deal with. For instance, now the revalidation of the BA came because we had to do it, not because we wanted to. Normative isomorphisms, where professional standards influence change. This is a little bit more unclear sometimes, whether it's kind of quite directed or it's more about this is how it should be. You know, there's a sense of a benchmark or a standard or something that we should be aspiring to. The metic isomorphism is also a really interesting one for the degree show, because it kind of feeds of anxieties around, you know, what we ought to be doing and how different institutions, different groups of different art schools, you know, how these things should operate. So let's begin with this idea of the audience. And of all the places where I looked for information about, you know, what are we up against, what are we dealing with, one of the things that I looked through was every single unit handbook and every single course handbook for all fine art courses within UAL. And this is a quote from one of our own ones from the BA Fine Art at Chelsea for the degree show unit. And this is one of the few places where the word degree show is actually uttered, because this is what I found, that it just doesn't really exist as something that is discussed, framed up, explained, or anything like that. So this is what our students are currently asked to do in the current frameworks. There's a lot riding on this, and there's a lot of kind of ideas around what an exhibition is, you know, what consolidation might mean, what a practice might be. All these things are sort of around here, but not articulated within this sort of statement. So what we can really think is perhaps one of the key audiences for this, and the kind of maybe the primary audience, is ourselves. We are, as when we assess as a kind of institution, it's about sort of conforming to this sort of framework and this kind of learning outcomes. So this is one of the learning outcomes that we apply when we are marking the degree show. This demonstrates systematic understanding and critical judgment in the conceptual and formal decisions made in the realization of your artworks, which are basically set up as an exhibition. There are, of course, students who don't make kind of traditional exhibitions as such, and you know, we do everything in our power to encourage very, very diverse practices, but there is something about the whole idea of this that we all kind of imagine a particular thing when we see this. And the whole assessment process, of course, happens before the degree show becomes public, so it's not been made public as such yet. This happens with the doors closed, and it's over by the time we open the door for the private view. The other thing to think about is what kind of agency do students have in this process? For instance, at Chelsea, we ask students to fill in a form where they sort of state their preferences, what they would kind of like, you know, like a blacked out space, or they would prefer to be near some daylight, or they would really like to do something that's slightly problematic with health and safety, perhaps, so we need special considerations for that. So there is this sort of whole process in place to try and set up something that really benefits the individual students' practice. And as staff, we kind of take on the role, not so much of a curator, I think, but more the role of a producer, you know, facilitator, somebody who makes it happen, and also really tries to work with the students, in terms of thinking about the best possible outcome of this situation. So this is where, in a way, staff and students are aligned in their desire to set up this amazing exhibition, the best one ever so far. But where it sort of diverges, of course, is around things like you know, ownership. For instance, the institution will take credit for the degree show. The degree show is a marketable tool. We just talked about this. It is the public face of the institution, and the desires there might be very contrary to individual students' practices and sites. And of course, the students have also, perhaps they are very mindful of, and we, in an entire education, they are mindful of these kinds of places, and we all are. We think about art as belonging to a sort of an idea of an art world. And we are thinking that the degree show must be able to sort of begin to address the needs of these kinds of places. So there's a isomorphism there in terms of the sort of mimetic, trying to demonstrate certain kinds of professionality that would enable a trajectory towards these kinds of places, which are kind of slightly vaguely understood. There's also something very interesting happening around the sales of artworks. For instance, at Chelsea, works are for sale, and up until very recently there was even a sales division that would take a commission of these, because suddenly there's this idea that value is attached to the works, which is a separate thing from the marking, from the assessments, from kind of a critical engagement, or from peer engagement. And what does that mean when suddenly a student sells all their work? And this could be a student who perhaps wasn't a particularly good student. It's a very interesting interesting part of this. So we're thinking about the success of the degree show. What makes for really the great show? We all have these years where we think, oh, that was a fantastic year, fantastic show. How do we measure it? What are the kind of ways that we do that? Of course, we could say, well, this year half the students sold out their work. That could be a performance indicator. Or we could say that this year it was seen by important collectors and curators. That's another way of thinking about it. Or it could be that this year there were more people present than there ever been before. It's another way to think about it. But again, this idea of how we connect value to this public moment is a really important one, and one that there is very, very little written about it. So we're concerned with this. We're really concerned with the sort of pedagogies around the academy and around the degree show process, and we try and sort of we have to adhere to certain elements that come to us through, for instance, at Chelsea, the UAL framework for assessment, for instance, and at the same time we also have to try and find a way of really working with the individual students' project, which could be extremely divergent. The different things they're doing are so different that the sort of handling of that becomes really, really critical. So one of the things that I think we do have to do, and we do end up doing, is, I started off by talking about the English garden and the gardenesque, and there's something about almost trying to turn the student exhibition into not just something exhibitionary, something that completely demonstrates all the trademark elements of an exhibition, but something that almost becomes exhibitionesque, something that's so recognizable as this particular kind of format and thing, that we can mark, and that we can then open the doors to a public afterwards. I don't know what those clocks are there, maybe to tell me that I'm almost out of time. These are the current marking criteria. We are actually just in the process of, across UAL, to not have 8 as is there, but to run them down to 5. But what will remain is that the 5 criteria will be exactly the same across every single art and design subject. So there's this very specific matrix that all fine art and design courses of all kinds at UAL have to make work. So this in itself is a particular normative sort of device that really fixes what a degree show will do. And I will end here now, the Academy and Society. So what is it? And what do we want? I think this becomes really critical questions. I mean, is the degree show something that can be a moment to really open the doors, and not just open the doors in this sort of vista into these spaces that have been where all sinks have been blocked off, furniture removed, kind of white cube gallery has been created within it, which is no longer the sort of processual art school, but rather the sort of product art school. Is there another way that we can have a kind of permeable moment that's actually about the processes of the art school, and not just the the products. And I think we do really need to think about this, particularly with this how art is under attack in schools, and there's less and less places for, in a way, young people to experience art as a process and not just as a product. And I think this is something that we really need to find a way to share with the world in some kind of way. Finally, I just want to say that the degree show has curation, the curatorial actually is one place that is very useful to kind of curatorial theory turned out to be perhaps the most useful, not pedagogic theory, not ideas about teaching and learning, but actually curatorial around thinking about the sort of ways that we can open this question up, the sort of potential within the degree show, and also just thinking about the last 20 years and how much things have changed around exhibition practices, which means that most degree shows in some ways almost seem a little bit anachronistic now. And the final slide is just this, because any image you saw in this presentation were taken off from this website, which is basically a place where students are encouraged to upload images of their work as part of this sort of making public, being in the world kind of moment of leaving the art school. Thank you.
Could you just revisit that notion of isomorphism that you were using and explain, for example, why you're using isomorphism rather than hylomorphism, which would be a sort of matching?
Yeah, I'm not a sociologist, and I found it used in a very productive way in an article by Morgan Quaintance where he talks about International Visual Arts, which he sort of talked about as a small institution trying to sort of mimic much larger institutions. And I thought actually it was a useful way to look at some of the separate forces that come to bear on the degree show. So from things that are to do with the art world, or with expectations, or with ideas of what good exhibitions might be or good art might be, to things that are kind of more institutional or what's the word, bureaucratic, things that come from the government, things that are through the QAA, and sort of see how sometimes these forces align and sometimes they almost work against each other. But they are very real forces, but some are directives. We have to do certain things. We have to, when we are revalidating, we do have to look at QAA benchmarks. So there's a specific things that we are dealing with. Whereas when it comes to ideas around what a good exhibition might be, that is very, very powerful. These ideas are very, very powerful, but they are not actually something we have to take into account. We could rethink that. We could think actually maybe it's the art school's role of rethinking the notion of publicness, and maybe the exhibition is kind of redundant in that process. So it was more that for me, and this is part of a much bigger research project, which I could only kind of jump across right now. It was a useful way of separating out what the different areas I felt that needed to be looked at, and the different sort of levels of force that they were exerting onto this moment, if that makes sense.
Mike, are you holding your hand up? Are you dividing the... Yeah, okay. Yes.
Just the final point is very incredibly interesting, the idea of curatorial theory being a way of thinking or rethinking what's possible in the degree show. But I was just wondering sort of where you might pick up on that. It sparked me thinking something we thought about is the educational turn in curatorial theory, and how those two things sort of mirror each other. It's a really interesting way of substituting them.
So I completely agree. And the last 20 years, the curatorial turn, well, that's maybe more from 2006-07, but the idea of since so some of the really kind of key texts that were printed around 1996, like Risa Greenberg and those sort of tomes on curating, there's been such a massive change, and particularly the curatorial turn has been part of that in terms of foregrounding process and not product. But the interesting thing about the educational turn, is that so much of that has happened sort of outside. It's sort of mimicking aspects of the art school, but not bringing that back in. And also the parts that it mimics is about process, about duration, about level playing field, non-hierarchical elements, all those things which actually we do have in the art school. It is hierarchical, and there are structures, and we do have to have a product at the end. So that's really interesting, and it's definitely something that could be looked at more. But in curatorial theory, there's also very little written about the degree show, which is interesting. One of the many places.
Thank you.